o te whaatalo whaatu i le mai mua mai a tutui le mamanua i le nei vaenga o le afiafi e o te whaatalo whaatu i whaasalonga masani le nei a le tātou KVCK. O le nei wawina atu ai le nei talanoanga whaapitoa e peona tau sila mai ia o le afiafi nei ia o le ua maua le avanoa o lau KVCK whaapea ai ma le tamaitai pālemia o le maloto to tasi o Samoa le afionga le sao whaapito le afionga ia fia me Naomi Mataafa o se avanoa whaauro le nei umwhauna tu ina mai lau KVCK ina ia ma tala noa ai fo'i ma se i whaalongo fo'i se fina ngalo le afionga le tamaitai pālemia e tu sai fo'i o nisu mata upu nisu fasidi whaapena tu ina mai le mamano le atunu u ia le ngate lea ia o le mai ai o le whonotanga a Samoa e lua pe ona whianga iei ma Amerika Samoa ia ma Samoa tuto tasi le nei vai aso o te whaatalo whaatuai la pe a whaifoto ama o mai a tātou whaasalaunga le nei mai lau KVCK ia ma whaavanoa fo'i le nei avanoa o te whaatalo whaatuai le a whio mai o le tamaitai pālemia o le malo tuto tasi o Samoa ia whia me malo whaafitai e mamoli atu ai le whaafitai tele lau a whionga o lona lei avanoa whaauro o te loa o le tele ia o tutuangia fo'i whaale malo i ro au mai ai nei Amerika Samoa awa ma whai ona whaavanoa ina mai lo teimi e tate tala no ai fo'i e tu sai o nisi o fasili e whia malamala mai fo'i nisi o le atunu nei ia la atu le avanoa mua i mosi nau saunoanga ona talu ai ona le telo fasili pe na sisilela ngana Peritania iona ta fesuia ia le whaapea o no mātou nei e bailinko le whaingo le tātou interview whaamolmole.
Ia, whatalo whatu i lau sunga tosi. Whaafitai fo i le au nanga le televise ona ua mawawose awa no e whaese tā whaatalo tanoanga. Ia, atonu fo i se au ngā mo le tapua inga whaafonga le tunu e le ngata ili nei fo i tu o le tunu ia tuila mamanu. Ia, masalo fo i o atu i o il tatu i tu i sisi fo ua mata ngofia fo ile nei awa noa ua whaitau tau sanga ele whemalanga ia tātou ono le whaamai. Ia, whaafitai le alo fo le atua ua matala atu ia no tanga sa pena ona whaintai ona tātou whewai. Ia, ma le mesiri lava, ia, tātou te maitauina ia le tūlanga o le whaamai i tu ese o lalang. Ia, ma eu foi leanga leo le tua mo Samoa e lua. Foi le maitauina lava, moni lava wa iei nisi ua maliliu. Ia, a fuafua i le whaitau miliona ma whaitau afe mawhau tangata i sia tunu. Ia, a olo whapena ona lawe a ipea i le lautia leo o nai o tātou tangata. Mātou taunu mai fo i talanoanga mālua e lua. Ia, mātou langona lava le ngā mawhanawhana i le tali mai o le whionga i le kōwana ma le whainga mālo i ona tūlanga whaalupe. Ia, mātou ngofia ia mea uma, whailoa inga o le whonatanga sa alo atu i hei. Ia, mamau ai fo i le awa noa e whailoa i ma ainga ua lewa na le whailoa ia e le ngata i lea, ia e o fo i a wālo mātou pasenga i whaipule. Ia, nā whio mai fo i si o mātou tu mālo le pa ia ia sa alwalasi ma tu e tia le whale atua ia le pangu mastangata. Ia, o i tu umai ia matafa e mātou ngofia i le whiasia sia i o tātou e lua. Ia, ma mātou whamoi fo i tari mālo pe a whio atu i le whionga i le kōwana ma ni fo i tu o le tunu. Whaafitai mō le walauri e whailta whaatalanoa.
Malo whaafitai lau whionga tu mai tai pālemia. For those who have been following Honourable Fiame's visit to American Samoa, it has been brilliant to have it's been a brilliant week having the Prime Minister of Samoa here with us here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Fiame is a very busy person, but she's made herself available to chat with KVCK News. Fiame, I think the last time you and I spoke like this was back in 2005. when you came to China, and I was working for China Central Television International, and you came over as Minister of Education with the teachers' dance group. I think that was the last time we spoke like this.
That's right. And that was a celebration of diplomatic relations, because we had diplomatic relations starting from 1975, so 30 years.
Long time.
So that's why the invitation was given for a cultural group to come over. Yeah, and you were having your international work experience,
Right.
and that was a wonderful communications network. You know, we were very impressed, not only locally, but you had quite a comprehensive international program.
Thank you very much. There's been a lot going on in Samoa, and I will get to that later. But first, can I ask, how are you, Fiame?
I'm very well, thank you. I started traveling last month. So, you know, like many people, I mean, we were and we are traveling, you know, as part of the government work. But it has also afforded us the opportunities to catch up with family in New Zealand, in Fiji, and now in American Samoa. And of course, in terms of the work, we've all been working virtually. So it's been excellent to have the opportunity to once again have face-to-face meetings with our counterparts in the different government administrations, and especially also for the leaders of the Pacific, because the PIFs has not been able to meet for close to 3 years. And, you know, especially given the contestability of our region at the moment with the geopolitics.
Right.
It's very important for the leaders to come together to ensure the unity of the region, and, you know, for us to make sure that we come to know each other with the leadership there, but to also ensure that as a region, and as a region of small states,
Right.
you know, unity is so important in terms of the international platforms to carry the messages from the Pacific with respect to climate change, which is the priority issue at the moment. But, you know, all other facets of human life, and through the platforms mostly of the UN,
Right.
and so forth.
Okay. When you began your career many, many years ago, because I know you started really young in Parliament, did you ever imagine that one day you would become the Prime Minister of Samoa?
Well, you know, my father was the first Prime Minister. And I saw firsthand how his work impacted on him. He passed away a relatively young man, 53. You know, a lot of people thought Matafa was a lot older. So, you know, I understood what it takes to hold that position, but that was not really the motivating factor for me. And because I grew up in a political family, I have an interest in political and public life, but more in the sense of making a contribution, not so much, you know, to hold, you know, the job, so to speak. But then, you know, having also been in Parliament since 1985, been in Cabinet since 1991, you know, it's not that I'm unfamiliar
Right.
with the workings of government. So, well, you know, with politics, you can never be quite sure where it takes you.
Right.
And so I suppose the short answer to your question is no, I didn't imagine. I was more about, you know, what I wanted to do with a career in politics, and, you know, making a contribution. And then I find myself in this position now. I think, you know, the time that I've spent since I became a member of Parliament, it's helpful, you know, for the.
Okay, Femi, let me take you back to the election of all elections we had. Definitely am not going to go through it, and you went through it. It was a pretty tough time for Samoa, yourself especially. Looking at it now, why did everything happen, can I ask?
Well, I suppose the most obvious one after any election is, you know, an outcome. I think the outcome was an unexpected one. So I think, you know, the government leading up to the election did not have an expectation to lose the election. In fact, I think Tuilepa went public to say that they expected to have 42 seats. So, you know, to answer your question, you know, I think it was an unexpected outcome.
Right.
And being such a narrow majority of one. So I suppose it offered, you know, all the possibilities for the last administration to try and maintain the holding of government. But, you know, an election is an election. And, you know, although it's a narrow margin, it's still the outcome and the result as determined by the vote, you know, of the country.
You know, Femi, I was there at the swearing in under the tent, the famous swearing in. And you know, and I remember vividly when you came, that morning very well. I saw the judiciary walking in, and of course they checked, and the doors were locked at Parliament. And I remember also when you came and you sat next to your lawyers. I think you were discussing what the next move would be. And despite everything that was going on at the time, you were very calm and collective, and I saw that. And this is one thing that I notice about you, is the fact that with everything that's going on, you are so calm, and you tend to be in your own, you know, in your own self, and you know, you don't want getting. How do you do it? You know, with so much that was going on, and yet, you know, you knew where you were going. How did you manage to navigate yourself through that?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing, I mean, the swearing in was just one element of what we had to go through. And I think I had always worked on the premise about the rule of law, which includes the electoral process, you know, and the determination by the country through vote. So, you know, I was confident that in having the number to formulate a government, that although we had, you know, these obstacles that had been thrown up, I firmly believed that the result of the election, the laws framing, you know, the governance of Samoa, would come through. For that particular day, I'd have to say it was no surprise to us that the doors were locked. That was always something that had the high possibility of happening, and especially with the head of state making changes to calling of Parliament, just prior to the day. So there was a high possibility that it would not happen. We had discussed it. We had options. So if you're asking me why I was calm, those were the... and I think, it's really important to have your focus in terms of what your goal is and what outcome you're looking for, and that you also, prepare for, what might possibly happen. So the holding of the swearing in later in the day, because we essentially came in the morning, Parliament was locked, so we just, left Mulino and then, put into place the plan B, so to speak, and carried it out later on in the day.
Yeah, because there was a lot of fuss about the swearing in under the tent. And I remember lately, during one of your interviews, I think it was with an international media, where you sort of mentioned that, the first Parliament of Samoa wasn't sworn inside a building. I mean, inside the Parliament. It was done at the Malaifono. I think that's what you said.
Well, it was very interesting. I was sitting in Molino under the tent, and someone sent me this caption of the swearing-in ceremony just outside the old Fono house, which was essentially on the Malai. So I thought it was, very interesting that, I hadn't even thought of it, but this person sent it to me. So, it was a controversial swearing in.
Right.
We did have a legal basis for it, and that was eventually borne out by the final decision of the courts to recognize the swearing in.
Excellent. It was beautiful. It was a very emotional day, beautiful day. And I was glad, I'm glad that I was part of it, really. Historical moment for Samoa. Can I ask, before that, the day you went to see Tuila Epa, that you were leaving the HRPP party, was it an easy decision to do, to go and see him, given that you were part of the HRPP for a very long time?
Oh yes, it was easy. It was easy because the reasons for my leaving was that I couldn't support legislation that had been put through by my party.
Right.
And I was away when legislation was processed through Cabinet. I came back, and I was the last flight into the country before lockdown. So I wasn't able to be in Parliament when it was processed through Parliament because I was in quarantine. So essentially, I'd missed the windows for making interventions at the appropriate time. So that was March 2020. So because the process in Parliament had gone to the second reading, my only other opportunity for making an intervention was when the parliamentary committee, made the rounds of consultations to the country. So when they came to my constituency towards the end part of their consultation, which was September, of the same year. And I'd also had my discussions with my constituency, so they understood where I was coming from. And I then made my position known as the Member of Parliament. So once having gone public, I knew then that I could not, stay with the party anymore. So this was a Wednesday, the 9th of September. So 10th, 11th, which was a Friday, I had my letter of resignation. And interestingly enough, Tulepa's office contacted my office to say he wanted to meet with me. Because, of course, having gone public, it then became, quite a contentious matter, especially as I was the Deputy Prime Minister. So it was the right thing to offer my resignation because, if you can no longer support a legislative program of your party, well, there's only really one option. But I had flagged with my constituency that this was a possible outcome, that I would need to resign. So in answer to your question, no, it wasn't difficult because it was something that I knew once I'd gone public. I had to do the right thing, so to speak.
So it was a thing of, can I say, was it like once you closed that door to the Emperor's office, was it like, yes, I did it, or was it, oh really, am I? Did you have any second thoughts of leaving? No?
No, not at all. Because I think once you make those kinds of decisions, you can't be, ambiguous in any way. The fortunate thing is that I was still able to move to become an independent Member of Parliament and to stay in the Parliament until the end of that term, so I could ensure representation of my constituency, but especially also, to be there for the final readings of these three bills that I, essentially disagreed with and ended up resigning on.
You were always outnumbered, Femi. I mean, in your party. I mean, I come on. We watch the phono religiously all the time. When you guys are live from a pier. How did you manage to work, across the divides of opinions in your party, in the previous HRPP party?
Well, I mean, you offer your opinion. So, because it is a party, you can't really control where other MPs' opinions are at. So you just need to accept. I think, I do think back, if I had been in Samoa when these bills were being processed, whether, the outcome might have been different. I suspect not.
Okay, so it's been a year already since you became Prime Minister of Samoa. It must be a beautiful feeling, though.
Yes, well, I mean, having done the campaign, having had the result of the election, and then having that period essentially between April and coming into government in July, it was it was a welcome relief, that we could actually then come into government and begin, the work that we're there to do. So, there was a lot of frustration, I think, on part of our side. But, we had to process through, and the process was mostly a legal one. And just thankful that that branch of government was still functioning, because the executive branch was not functioning, and Parliament wasn't able to meet. So essentially, it really needed the third arm, the judiciary, to be doing their work, and we're very thankful, that the systems were able to uphold the process that we needed to go through.
Fime, can I ask you about the 10% bill? As there was much consternation over the interpretation of the 10% bill, I really want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on that legislation, Whamulemule?
Well, I recall that after 2012, when the Pacific leaders met in the Cook Islands, there was a declaration on gender equality. And the representation by women was a priority in terms of that report.
Right.
So I remember that Tuilaepa came back, and given that the leaders had made this declaration, he then went to work to develop legislation. So that's the background to the development of that legislation. And when I talk about that 10% piece of legislation, it's essentially a floor. It's not a ceiling.
Right.
Quite often, people set targets. Whether it be 10, 20, 30. Internationally, the percentage is the 30%. Minimum. But for us in Samoa, essentially, this piece of legislation said no less than 10%. I think the idea is good. Although if you read the transcript of the Hansard, I was there and I listened to the debate. If you went on the debate itself, I don't think that bill would have passed.
Right.
By the opinions offered. But this is where the party line works in politics. So essentially, through the leadership of Tuilaepa and the numbers that the HRPP had, we were able to get that piece of legislation through. What does concern me, though, is the experience that we've gone through in the last election. It became quite a contentious part of the electoral process. I don't even want to go into the interpretation of 10% because that's a bit embarrassing.
Because I know for a fact that you didn't support this piece of legislation when it came through, or did you?
No, I did.
Okay.
I did. But what we've seen come out in the last election was that, and as a Faipule,
right,
my concern is, although it always had the opportunity to see an increase of actual numbers in the House, depending on how many women had to be brought in. So I think the change of the Constitution was, if the maximum number of women to be brought in, which was 5, the House numbers could have gone up to 55, 56,
right,
depending on, at the time that we did the law, it was 49, right? So it meant that if you brought in 5 women, the House numbers could increase to 54. So when the numbers increased to 51 constituencies, if you brought in 5 women, if no women came in, then it would take it up to 56. Now, that is a concern because of the implications of cost when you have increasing numbers of members in the House. And the other contentious element, I think, in that particular piece of legislation that we saw last time is that with numbers, especially even numbers, we have the situation of having hung parliaments.
Right.
Right? So that's why we always try and have uneven numbers in the total of representation so that we don't get to the situation of hung parliaments. But because women's representation, and its flexibility depending on how many women come in, you could always then have an even number. And when you have even numbers, you have the opportunity to have hung parliaments. And no parliament ever wants to get into that situation. So, those are just few of the contentious issues that have arisen in the last election under this piece of legislation. So I think we need to do a review.
Right.
I mean, the intent, of course, is a good intent, and I would welcome a higher percentage of women's participation. But there's always the argument, whether you do it through special measures or whether you do it, that everyone competes in the same way. So, you win an election and that's how you get in.
Fime, last year during the election, there was a lot of conversation surrounding the port that China was going to build in Samoa. Are you concerned about the amount of debt that we owe to China?
Not so much to China in particular, because every country has debt. Our concern is that we have a particular level of debt which is considered sustainable, and when you get to a certain point, then it's a red flag that it's unsustainable. So when we came into government, that level had already been achieved. So it's not rocket science. You don't get into an administration, your debt level is at such a position, and then you would, consider a very big project, as the port project was. So it becomes a matter of where do you want to put your priorities, given the status of debt that the government is in.
Yeah. Staying with China, how do you see the relationship between Samoa and China?
We were probably one of the first countries in the Pacific to formulate a diplomatic partnership with China in 1975.
Yeah.
I think that was during Tupula Efi's administration. I think we've had a relationship with China that's worked very well. I mean, most countries like to have relationships with China, especially because it's such a big market.
Right.
So, the relationship has been a positive one. I think the contestability at the moment is essentially about spheres of influence, right? And I think people need to be very clear. I think I said this in another interview that I had, that it's very, interesting that in one sphere, we talk about having positive relations, and especially trading relations with different partners. And then in another sphere, the dialogue is essentially about influence. So it doesn't necessarily balance out. Right. I think for small countries like Samoa, we spend most of our time navigating, through the spheres of influence, at the same time wanting also to keep a focus on, relationships that we have with our different development partners.
Now, China's growing reach in the Pacific region is unsettling for the United States of America and its allies, and of course, American Samoa is a territory of the U.S. Has this come up in your conversations with the current administration?
Which administration?
The Manu and Talawenga administration. Has this come up since you're here this week?
No, no. That hasn't been part of our discussions. I suppose because the discussion is between the two Samoas. I think if we've had a discussion about internal relations or external relations rather, it's been about American Samoa's participation in regional spheres.
Right.
So because, American Samoa is a member of SPC, but is not a full member of PIFS.
Right.
They are members of some of the other crop agencies. So, that was more the range that dealt with the external relations. Of course, we're very mindful on American Samoa's relationship with the US. And, well, to put it frankly, it's none of our business.
Yeah, because Nomea Kvzktv yesterday mentioned during the meeting that this is one thing that Samoa will support, American Samoa, is to push their membership through PIF.
Yeah.
Is this a position still?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not only through PIFs, but also any other regional agency. I think it's very important. One group is, of course, the Polynesian group. And American Samoa had chaired more recently that grouping. Yeah. We're still trying to organize it to see where we may settle on where we place an office for the Polynesian group. Yeah.
Okay. Femia, you attended the first Pacific Island Forum Leaders meeting as Prime Minister of Samoa. How did you feel it went? And what dynamics have you noticed have changed due to changes in our leadership?
Well, before the PIFS meeting, I was there a couple of weeks earlier. And this had to do with the particular sort of mechanism, political dialogue, to bring back the members from the Northern Pacific who had indicated they wanted to leave. So there's been quite an extensive piece of work done, by the leaders to mend the relationships within the organization. So I was there, and 6 of us were able to begin a process to bring back the North. So I suppose that really was a priority issue, because you can't talk about regional unity and have, one section of the family not
going
being
the other
there,
way.
going the other way. So I think that was a very positive way to start the leaders meeting face to face. There's also ongoing work about reforming the organization, looking at processes which had led to the North sort of moving away. So the organization needed to reflect to see how its governance structures and processes were more inclusive, to ensure that there's equitable participation by all the members. So I was very pleased to be able to meet my fellow leaders face to face, and of course, because I've been around for so long, I know most of them. So, but it was an opportunity to meet other new leaders, like the new Prime Minister from Australia. I think he was the latest addition.
Albanese.
Yeah. And I hadn't met some of the other leaders before, Sukhavare and James Marape from PNG. The Prime Minister from Vanuatu. We'd met virtually, but we hadn't met face to face.
Face to face. Your recent visit to Rwanda, it was very beautiful. Of course, I followed it. As a result, Samoa will now be hosting the CHOCOM 2024, the first Pacific Island nation to do so. Congratulations on securing that. Can you share your thoughts on this major accomplishment, and what was Samoa's desired intention of hosting this large and significant event?
Well, the original bid for hosting went in 2018. The CHOGM leaders weren't able, because they meet every 2 years. So the CHOGM leaders weren't able to meet in 2020. And because, bids are put in and it gets processed, we felt that there shouldn't be any issues around our hosting in 2024. We do ask, the question, should we still belong to the Commonwealth? And what does the Commonwealth do for us? It's one international platform. The world is organized into different blocks.
Right.
And this is a particular block that I think services, the needs and aspirations of Samoa. A large number, it's close to 2/3 of the membership of the Commonwealth are small states. So, that's one element of why it's important that we remain with the organization. It's an English-speaking organization. So, you go to the UN and I think there are 7 or 9 working languages. It's very difficult. It's difficult enough to do resolutions, but when you're trying to do it in so many different languages, it makes it more difficult. So that's one advantage. It's predominantly Christian, mostly through its colonial past.
Right.
So, there are all those, and the range of services provided through the Commonwealth has served Samoa well. So, it's a good organization for us to remain in. And we're very pleased, as you say, that Samoa will be hosting first time in the Pacific. And like everything in the Pacific, although Samoa is hosting, a bit similar to the SIDS meeting in 2014, we do want to make it also a Pacific event.
Right. Fantastic. Now, you were so well received in New Zealand. I think that you were mobbed by people in New Zealand. Yeah, of course. It was great to see the attention you received in New Zealand by our people there. What was it like to be in New Zealand? I know it's a second home for you because you went to school there, you've lived there. You spent quite a bit of your life in New Zealand as well, when you went to school there. What was it like coming back to New Zealand this time, not as a minister, but as the Prime Minister of the independent state of Samoa?
This year we're celebrating the 60 years of our independence, but it's also the 60th year of the Treaty of Friendship. And in fact, we return this weekend and hosting the New Zealand Prime Minister and her delegation on Monday. Because the 1st of August is the day where the signing of the treaty took place in 1962. So that's quite significant. As you say, you know, I've spent a fair bit of my younger life in New Zealand, so I'm very familiar with it. You know, we have so many families and connections to New Zealand. I would have to say that with respect to the Samoan community, it was, as you say, extraordinary. I was a bit overwhelmed. And it's very easy, you know, to withdraw a bit if, you know, this happens. But then I had to collect myself. And you will understand too, because you were asking me earlier about last year's election. There was such a high level of participation by the Samoan diaspora.
Right.
So, and you could feel that. And so I thought, well, you know, these people had journeyed with us through that period last year. And you could feel that, you know, they wanted to make the contact. So you just had to embrace it and enjoy it, which I did.
I did.
You know, it was, I mean, it was very touching, very overwhelmed, you know, by the spirit of welcome and, yeah, and of course people's generosity for Elia, not just my family's, which, you know, does happen, but just the general Samoan population. And of course, it was my first state visit to New Zealand. We were, just like we've been received so well here in American Samoa, the welcome from New Zealand, you know, was very warm. We had very good and substantial conversations with the Prime Minister and her administration.
My Lord. At the opening of the two Samoa talks this week, you said, and I quote, in your opening remarks, you said, what is most important is the ability to facilitate communications between our two governments in a manner suited to the promotion of good relations while adhering the accepted standard of best practice. What did you mean by that, Fiame?
Well, if you break that down, first of all is communications, and you will note that the first session of the meeting was essentially a meet and greet. You can talk with people, but if you can see their faces, if you can hear them speak and say who they are, what they do, it makes the communications a lot easier. So, I mean, we've been doing these talks for a while now, but we did take note that, you know, both administrations are relatively new from last year. So it was important not only to continue the two Samoa talks, but to continue it in a manner that these two new administrations had a very clear understanding of how we would proceed. Now, we are two Samoas. We're connected through custom, you know, and our traditions, our genealogical connections. But we are also two administrations that are premised, you know, in particular legal frameworks. You know, the status of Samoa as an independent state, American Samoa is a territory of the US. So, you know, we need to be very clear about how that works in terms of the relationships. But underpinning that, you know, all the other stuff is, you know, legal frameworks and so forth. But, you know, if we have a set sort of scope of what we want to talk about, what we want to work together with, I think we also need to work from a... So, you know, I think clarity of messages. It's so easy to misconstrue, misunderstand. So I think, whenever you're working in any partnership type arrangement, there are so many things you just need to be very clear on, so that you can move forward with more ease, rather than sort of being interrupted because, there have been misunderstandings about how we work together.
Ato Samoa, the theme for the meeting. You tend to like it.
I do.
Yeah. Can you tell us why, Fiume?
Well, I actually thought it was a very, I think it's a very creative expression,
Right.
right, of what the spirit of the talks is about, Samoa as a whole.
Right.
So, yeah, you could, we talk about Samoa Lua. So Samoa Lua, two entities.
Right.
But when you say Atoa Samoa, you're talking about a singular unit. So I thought it was a very clever conceiving of an ideology that brings us together.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I get it. I get it now. Yeah, because I tell you, there was a lot of people have been commenting about the Ato Samoa. Some, like you expect that some may not like it, but at the end, I think it's beautiful, and you're right. It's great. It brings everyone together.
It's inclusive.
Right, very inclusive. And this sort of ties in with what you said, and Lemanu said the same thing, that o Samoa o le ainga.
Iwe.
And you made that very clear, which is brilliant. We nearly finished, Fiume. Whamolmole. What can I ask? What benefits can this talk, the Ato Samoa, bring for both American Samoa and independent Samoa?
Oh, I think it can be as big as we want to make it, or as small as we're prepared to work it. So it's really up to us. But if you look what has been achieved to date, I think that's a good start. And I think probably the best way we work together is through the health sector. The agricultural sector, I think it's been a bit varied. At times it's been good, at times it hasn't been good. The whole issue around mobility, travel, migration, work mobility and so forth. I think that's been quite a ongoing area for talk. Trading, of course, business development, and of course, the Pacific holds the issue of climate change is a priority one. And together, with the oceans, I think it's a nexus that is very pertinent to our particular region, because we are the Blue Pacific.
We are.
The ocean continent. So, for instance, at the last Oceans Conference, there was a developing dialogue on sea mining. So, if we have concerns about, the environment in terms of land masses, that's a whole new other sphere when we start talking about mining the seabed.
Fiume, Samoa is hosting in September. What are we going to look forward to when we come over?
Well, first of all, getting a clearer map of what we would like to do together. I think we've formulated the information, essentially the base information, and what has been prioritized from this side and the other side. So, from a work perspective, I imagine that we'd do more when we meet in September. Okay. We've not been able to join in for the different flag raisings because of COVID, and because we're having a whole year celebration for the 60th anniversary in Samoa. We're seeing the September or Te Wila as part of the activities to continue that celebration, and I think a delegation from American Samoa would mark that period, because we've always enjoyed hosting when it's our Flag Day, and we've been invited to Te Wila's Flag Day, so that's one element to it. And what I think would be good, rather than just doing the talk and so forth, is we might plan, some field trips, so we can see some of the aspects of the work happening in Samoa. I'd really like it to, if possible, host part of the trip in Hawaii.
Right, fantastic. So much looking forward to it. I cannot wait. I've asked you this question before we wrap things up. I've asked you this question before, and I'm going to ask you again. You're Prime Minister now. You sit in that caucus room, in your cabinet room, should I say, and you have the portrait of your father amongst the other previous Prime Ministers there. It must be a beautiful feeling, though, to know that your dad's looking down on you while you're doing your work.
Well, it's either beautiful or it makes me nervous.
But you know what I mean? Like, it must be nice to know that your father is constantly with you in the office, with this. Because I know Matafa would have been so proud of you now if he was still alive.
Well, I mean, it's a fact. That Matafa was the first Prime Minister. But it's not something, though, that is sort of sitting on me the whole time.
Right.
And, I mean, the thing is, for this time now, the situation that we find ourselves in, I mean, if there's any thinking back to Matafa, it's more not only so much him, but also the time, because one of the driving elements of why I was so unhappy with the laws, that I disagreed with, is that it so went against what the constitutional fathers had provided for us. So if there's anything, it's just a reminder to me constantly of the concepts and thinking of our forefathers when they established the independent state of Samoa. It's premised on law, but of course strongly underpinned, as we saw with this visit, with custom and tradition, and especially our Christian faith. So if there's anything, it's more a timely remembrance of a time when the idea of of an independent state was established by those people.
Fia mai o mai el ta taimi ai o la atu atu ele ava noa I te sau noa ai e wha mai ai le ta proklami e mori atu le whawhtai tele mo le whaavano ina o lau taimi la o fionga le sa whapito o lau fionga fo le tamaitai pāle mia o le tātou mālo tutotas o no te loa le tele o tutuangi le so o whaavano mai lava lau taimi e tate tala noa I nungo le tātou KVCK e wafo le whaafonga mai I le ngata fo I lo tātou o tunu I nei, ai mai se lava I la tō na mata I tuwina le teimi na ofi ai tutono le palemene, ai le ngata I lea, o le sau wale o sau wai o mai lava le teimi le nei I whai o malo. La tua tu le ava noa te sau noa wha mai al tāpolo kalami. Ia ona mai ai loa la ia, wha mole lava, wha aftai mo le ava noa.
Ia, whaftai tosi. Ia, o tūlanga masani lava I whataltala noanga whapene o le ava noa mō le whasalalau. Mai o le aua mai a foi o na whai a le tau mawainga I le wao malo e lua I le aswana nafi. Ia, a tonu o le foi sa mwhai o na pueina I nisi o tau whasalaunga. Ia, ai o le anganga e le ngata I tau mawainga o whelo inga I le awa whaatali foi ma le li tae au o le neitu o le tunu. O le langona lava I ai o le mawhanawhana I le foi le fusia whaatasi o tātou pe o le mātou upu na whai. Foi le o mātou o se malosi o mātou se paulo. O mātou o le itu tino o le ainga. Pe o le anganga lava na e whaonga ai foi le tā whaatalanoanga e whao atua I le anganga whaafitai nei foi tu o le tunu. I le anganga whaafitai le tali whaaloalo ma le tele o whamanuianga o whaalolonga ma tūlanga o ma whapena. Ia ai mese o le whinangalo o le whainga malo fia whaawawina ia se ngā luenga whaiwhatasi. Awa ia se manuia o tātou tangata. Ia, pe whaonga I nai le avanua lea I le mai mo tāpoi mai foi o le malo le tunu. Whao tuai ia le nā nganga. Ia, masa whaatino I upu o whailoa inga ma tau mawainga. Ia, mane nei foi tu o le whainga malo. Ia, manuia tele ia le au nanga. Ia, e sa oi, o le ua ruafe malerima le ngata I le ta interview muni. Ia, o le mesiri o le ua toi ta miro mai. Ia toi whai tata le Samoa o umatata le Isaina.
Isaina. Fia me whaaftai tele veia o whai ma whongata mole o le pule ngal KVCK e mole toi le whaaftai tele. Ai le whaafnoina mai o lo taimi, la wa whionga le sa whaapito, la wa whionga le taitai o le tātou o tunu I Samoa. Ia, o le nā ua, mai mo mai lo tātou o tunu I le mātala noanga whaapitoa, ala nei a fiafi a le KVCK, ia ma le whionga le sa whaapito, le palemia o le malo o tasi o Samoa, nisi foi o mata upu, sa whaapeona fia si le fia le atunu, nisi o tali le nā, atunu le nā, o manino, ia nisi foi o fasili sa whaapeona wha o mai, nisi o le tātou o tunu, ia ma o mawhai o na mātala talonga tuai le nei a fiafi, ma le whionga I le tamatai palemia. O le tātou proklame le nei, la mwhena mai moai lungo le tātou Facebook, ia la ngata fo lea, o penga te whailangi a lau KVCK, ia manui tele le nei a fiafi, fa soi foia.